Harlem had gone quiet in the way it only did before something irreversible. The room wasn't empty, but no one filled the space with unnecessary words. Smoke hung low, glasses sat untouched, and men avoided meeting Bumpy Johnson's eyes. Power usually announced itself here through routine, through comfort, through familiarity. Tonight, it stalled. A message had arrived, carried carefully, delivered without drama, and it landed heavier than gunfire ever could. The contract wasn't the shock. Contracts were part of the landscape, traded like weather reports, expected sooner or later by anyone who lived long enough. What froze the room was the name attached to it. When it was spoken, conversation didn't stop. It never started again. The hitman wasn't a rival or a hungry climber or an outsider chasing reputation. It was blood. His brother. Bumpy didn't react the way men expected. He didn't curse, didn't rise, didn't demand clarification. His face tightened slightly, not with anger, but with recognition. In Harlem, family was protection. It was also vulnerability. Everyone in the room understood that this wasn't business crossing into personal territory. This was personal tearing through business without permission. The men present felt it immediately. Street logic failed in moments like this. There was no clean solution, no clever angle. Loyalty demanded one response. Survival demanded another. Either choice would leave something broken behind. Bumpy sat with that understanding without flinching, absorbing the weight in silence while others shifted uncomfortably, grateful it wasn't their name being tested. His brother wasn't a stranger pulled from memory. He was shared meals, shared bloodlines, shared history carried long before Harlem claimed either of them. Whatever roads they had taken since, that connection didn't thin with time. It waited. And now it stood between Bumpy and tomorrow. Power meant nothing in that moment. Territory, influence, reputation, all of it shrank under the gravity of family. Bumpy had outmaneuvered rivals, negotiated peace with enemies, survived wars that erased entire crews. None of that prepared him for this. You could fight a rival without regret. You could remove a threat and sleep afterward. Blood left stains that never faded. No one spoke because no one knew what could be said. Advice felt dangerous. Sympathy felt intrusive. The room respected the silence because silence was the only thing that didn't demand a decision yet. Bumpy's calm unsettled them more than rage would have. Rage was familiar. This was something colder, heavier, and far more complicated. The contract existed now. Whether it was honored or not, it had changed the balance. Somewhere outside that room, his brother had accepted a role that could not be undone. Somewhere inside, Bumpy understood that time had begun working against both of them. This wasn't about who pulled a trigger first. It was about whether blood could be outrun or if it always caught up eventually. Harlem had seen men face death before. It had rarely seen a man forced to choose between survival and his own flesh. Nothing violent happened that night. No orders were given. No names were added to lists. But everyone there knew they were witnessing the beginning of something that would not end cleanly. The danger hadn't arrived with noise. It had arrived with recognition. And once blood entered the room, no amount of power could make it leave. This knowledge sat with everyone long after they left, seeping into the streets and stairwells beyond the door. By morning, Harlem would speak differently, move carefully, remember what had been revealed without ever naming it aloud. A test had been set, not of strength, but of loyalty. And the answer would reshape every life it touched, including the two men bound by blood and consequence forever in ways neither could escape completely. Before Harlem ever whispered his name with caution, before power settled into his posture, Bumpy Johnson was just a boy growing up alongside his brother in a world that demanded resilience early. Their childhood wasn't defined by ambition or crime, but by necessity. They learned survival together, not through schemes, but through shared hunger, shared winters, shared understanding that no one was coming to save them. Family wasn't an idea then. It was shelter. They slept under the same roof, wore each other's hand-me-downs, and learned quickly how to read moods before words were spoken. Their bond formed in silence as much as in laughter. When trouble came, it came to both of them. When food was scarce, they split it without counting. Loyalty wasn't taught, it was assumed, the same way breathing was. Harlem had not shaped them yet. The streets hadn't claimed their attention or demanded their allegiance. Their world was smaller, tighter, built on trust rather than reputation. They watched each other's backs because that was how boys survived where they came from. There were no grand plans, only days to get through and nights to endure. Whatever strength Bumpy would later display had its roots there, forged beside someone who knew him before he learned restraint. As they grew, the city began offering different answers to the same questions. Opportunity didn't arrive evenly. One brother learned to navigate structure, to move carefully, to understand how order could be imposed even in chaos. The other learned to move faster, to react rather than calculate, to rely on instinct where patience felt like weakness. Neither choice felt wrong at the time. They were responses to the same pressure, bent in different directions. Their divergence wasn't loud. There was no single argument, no moment where paths split dramatically. It happened quietly, through decisions that felt small but accumulated weight. Different friends, different mentors, different definitions of respect. What bound them remained, but it stretched, thin enough to allow misunderstanding to grow without being noticed. They still shared history, and history carries obligation. Even as their worlds expanded, that early bond remained a reference point. It softened confrontations and delayed reckonings. They knew each other's tells, each other's weaknesses. That knowledge could protect, but it could also be weaponized once trust eroded. Bumpy's rise didn't erase his past. It complicated it. Power introduced rules that childhood never required. Loyalty expanded beyond blood into territory, people, responsibility. His brother watched from close enough to feel excluded, far enough to feel replaced. That distance bred resentment slowly, without announcement. What made the coming conflict unbearable was that neither man was a stranger to the other. There was no villain to simplify the story. Just two men shaped by the same beginning, interpreting survival differently. One believed order preserved life. The other believed action preserved dignity. Both believed they were right. Harlem would later frame this as inevitability. But inevitability only exists in hindsight. At the time, it felt like choice, layered on choice, until turning back required more humility than either could afford. Love didn't disappear. It hardened. It became something heavy, unspoken, capable of doing damage simply by existing. The tragedy wasn't that they stood on opposite sides of power. It was that they recognized each other fully when the contract surfaced. The boyhood bond didn't vanish. It surfaced, sharp and painful all, making the threat unbearable not because it was deadly, but because it was intimate. You don't outgrow the people who raised you, who stood beside you when the world was smaller. You carry them into every room, every decision. That was the collision forming now, not between rivals, but between memories and survival, between who they had been and who they had become. The foundation of love didn't protect them from this moment. It guaranteed it would hurt more. And as Harlem prepared to witness consequences, both brothers were already trapped by a past neither could escape, only reinterpret through loss. The contract didn't arrive with drama. It moved the way business always moved in that world, quietly, efficiently, without regard for history. By the time the brother heard Bumpy's name spoken across a table, the decision had already been shaped by years he couldn't undo. He hadn't set out to become a hitman. He became reliable. And reliability in the criminal economy is what turns men into tools. His reputation had been built slowly, job by job, favor by favor. He showed up when others hesitated. He finished what he started. He kept his mouth shut afterward. In a system that valued results over sentiment, those traits carried weight. The work didn't begin as murder. It began as enforcement, protection, reminders, delivered with fists instead of bullets. Each step felt like adaptation, not escalation, until adaptation became identity. Pressure never arrived all at once. It accumulated. Debts, promises, names remembered by the wrong people. Refusal carried consequences long before acceptance did. By the time the contract surfaced, walking away no longer felt like an option. Saying no meant exposure. Exposure meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant death. The math was brutal and impersonal. When Bumpy's name was attached, The room changed, not because of fear, but because of recognition. The brother understood immediately what this meant, not emotionally, but structurally. The system did not care about childhood or blood. It cared about completion. Contracts were not requests. They were tests of usefulness. Declining one marked you as unreliable, and unreliability was punished quickly. This was not revenge, not jealousy, not hatred. That distinction mattered. It stripped the act of passion and replaced it with something colder. Professional obligation, the kind that allows men to sleep afterward because emotion never entered the calculation. The brother told himself this was work, not choice. That belief was the only thing keeping him steady. The criminal economy does not reward conscience. It exploits it. It waits until a man has too much to lose before demanding he prove his value. The brother had crossed that threshold years earlier without realizing it. Each completed job tightened the net. Each favor owed narrowed his options. By the time the contract found him, refusal would have been louder than acceptance. He thought briefly of the past, not sentimentally but practically. Childhood memories did not translate into leverage. There was no clause for family. The contract didn't ask how they were related. It asked if the job could be done. That indifference made it easier and harder at the same time. He weighed alternatives that didn't exist. Running was fantasy. Confession was suicide. Warning Bumpy would expose him before protection could form. Every path led to loss. The system was designed that way. It forced men into corners where survival required silence and obedience. Accepting the contract didn't feel like betrayal in the moment. It felt like continuation. Another step along a path already chosen. That rationalization mattered. It allowed him to function, to plan, to breathe. If he framed it as inevitable, he didn't have to face the moral weight directly. The brother understood that this wasn't about killing Bumpy Johnson, the king. It was about removing a problem the system had identified. Kings were replaceable. Order was not. That understanding stripped the act of meaning, which was exactly how the system preferred it. What made it unbearable was knowing Bumpy would understand all of this instantly. There would be no confusion between them, no misinterpretation. Bumpy knew how contracts worked. He knew how pressure shaped men. That shared knowledge offered no comfort. It only removed excuses. By the time the contract settled into place, the brother wasn't angry or afraid. He was resolved. Resolution is what systems like this demand. Emotion complicates efficiency. He prepared himself the way he always had, by narrowing focus until nothing existed outside the task. The contract didn't care who they were. It didn't care who they had been. It cared only that one man had been selected to remove another. And once that machinery engaged, the question was no longer whether the brother would act, but how Bumpy would respond to a test that cut deeper than any rival ever could. Nothing was said between them, and that was what made it unbearable. No messages passed, no warnings leaked, no attempts were made to soften the truth or reframe it. The knowledge existed fully formed, sitting in the space between two men who understood the rules well enough to know that speaking would only complicate what was already inevitable. Bumpy Johnson carried that silence with discipline. He did not change his routines. He did not tighten his circle or advertise concern. From the outside, nothing shifted. Inside, everything had already moved. He knew who held the contract. He knew why it had been accepted. He knew that love did not cancel obligation in this world. That understanding settled into him without spectacle. The brother felt it too. The silence was not absence, it was presence without permission. Every familiar memory pressed against the present, demanding recognition while offering no solution. He imagined conversations that would never happen, explanations that would not be heard, apologies that would not change outcomes. Knowing replaced asking, and knowing was heavier. They occupied the same city, moved through the same gravity, yet remained separated by restraint. Crossing that distance verbally would have turned knowledge into negotiation. Negotiation implied hesitation. Hesitation was dangerous for both men. Silence preserved clarity. It kept the conflict clean, even as it poisoned everything else. Bumpy understood that reacting publicly would shrink the moment. Anger would invite misinterpretation. Threats would turn something precise into something emotional. He refused to do either. His restraint was not forgiveness. It was respect for the seriousness of what had been set in motion. This was not a feud. It was a test of principles colliding. For the brother, the quiet was torture. Noise would have allowed him to brace, to argue, to justify. Silence offered no defenses. It forced him to sit with the truth of what he was preparing to do and why. Every day that passed without confrontation deepened the weight. Each normal interaction with the world felt counterfeit. Others noticed the stillness without understanding it. Rooms felt colder. Conversations slowed. Men who knew Bumpy well sensed calculation rather than surprise. This was how he behaved when outcomes mattered. The absence of reaction became its own signal, more unsettling than any display of force could have been. In this space between action and consequence, patience became the battlefield. It required more strength than violence ever had. Violence ends things quickly. Patience extends them, allowing doubt and memory to work unchecked. Both men were trapped inside that extension, aware that time was not neutral. It was shaping the final decision. Bumpy weighed not survival, but meaning. He had lived long enough to know that how a conflict was handled mattered as much as how it ended. This was blood. Blood demanded precision, not impulse. Any move he made would echo outward, teaching others what family meant under pressure. That lesson would outlive them both. The brother weighed obligation against identity. He was not choosing between right and wrong. He was choosing between two forms of death, one immediate, one internal. Silence forced him to confront that truth without distraction. It stripped away excuses until only responsibility remained. No one else could intervene. This was not a situation that benefited from witnesses. The quiet protected everyone involved by preventing premature conclusions. It allowed the truth to remain contained where it belonged. In that stillness, both men understood something rare. Action would come, but it would come once, and it would define everything. Until then, silence held. It pressed in from all sides, shaping resolve, sharpening consequence, and ensuring that when the decision finally arrived, it would not be confused, rushed, or mistaken for anything other than what it was. Some conflicts announce themselves with noise. This one announced itself by refusing to speak, and in that refusal the path forward narrowed until only one step remained. There are moments when power becomes a burden rather than a shield, and this was one of them. Bumpy Johnson stood at the center of a decision no reputation could soften. He could protect his own life, preserve the structure he had built, and ensure Harlem remained stable under his watch. Or he could protect his blood, the one tie that existed before titles, territory, and consequence. What he could not do was protect both. Delay offered no refuge. Time did not dissolve responsibility, it sharpened it. Every hour that passed forced the choice to grow heavier, more defined. In another world, this would have been simple. Blood before everything. But Bumpy did not live in that world. He lived in one where hesitation endangered others, where leadership meant absorbing loss so it did not spread outward. He understood the cost immediately. If he moved to save himself, something sacred would be severed forever. If he spared his brother, the message would fracture everything he governed. Men would question the rules. Rivals would test the exception. Order would erode slowly, then all at once. Survival in that scenario would be temporary at best. This was not a question of courage. It was a question of arithmetic. How many lives depended on clarity? How many depended on precedent? Bumpy had always believed that leadership meant choosing the outcome that prevented the most damage, even when that outcome was personally devastating. Knowing that did not make the decision easier. It made it lonelier. Family complicated everything because family carried memory. He remembered nights when there had been nothing but hunger and each other. He remembered protection that had nothing to do with power and loyalty, that was not enforced by consequence. Those memories did not argue for mercy. They argued against inevitability. That made them dangerous. Survival did not feel like winning here. It felt like amputating something vital to keep the body alive. He knew that whatever he chose would follow him forever, not as regret alone, but as definition. people would never know the full weight of the decision, and that ignorance was part of the price. Leadership rarely received understanding, it received results. The idea that some choices leave no clean hands is not abstract to him. It was immediate and intimate. There would be no version of the future where this ended without permanent loss. The question was not who would die, but what would be destroyed. Blood or balance, family or foundation. Bumpy examined his own limits honestly. He knew he could live with grief more easily than he could live with collapse. That realization did not come from coldness. It came from responsibility. Harlem depended on him to be consistent. Consistency required sacrifice. He had demanded that of others countless times. Now it demanded him. The weight of the choice did not harden him. It exhausted him. There was no anger to lean on, no righteousness to hide behind. Only acceptance. Acceptance that leadership sometimes required becoming the villain in your own story so that others could continue theirs uninterrupted. He did not look for permission. He did not seek counsel. This was not a decision that benefited from shared burden. He carried it alone because it belonged to him alone. When he finally committed internally, there was no relief, only stillness. The kind that follows acknowledgement, not resolution. Whatever happened next would be final. There would be no revision, no justification that could restore what was lost. He understood that the moment he chose survival, something inside him would not survive. That was the real cost. In that understanding, the choice became unavoidable, not because it was right, but because it was necessary. Harlem required continuity, order required clarity, and clarity demanded a sacrifice that no one envied, least of all the man who had to make it. What followed did not arrive with noise or warning. There were no raised voices, no public reckoning, no version of events that could be repeated with certainty. Harlem woke up to a change it could feel but not trace. The decision Bumpy Johnson made unfolded the way he preferred outcomes to unfold. Quietly, efficiently, and without an audience. The brother was simply no longer present. He did not appear in familiar places. His name stopped surfacing in casual conversations. There was no explanation offered, and none requested. In Harlem, results mattered more than reasons. People learned early that asking for details was not curiosity, but confusion. And confusion was dangerous. No one marked the ending with ceremony. No police cars lingered. No reporters arrived looking for a story. There was nothing dramatic to photograph. Whatever line had been crossed had been corrected cleanly enough that it left no obvious trace. That absence was intentional. Absence carried clarity without inviting challenge. The city adjusted the way it always did. Behavior shifted before language caught up. Men spoke more carefully. Meetings ended earlier. Boundaries that had blurred briefly snapped back into place. Harlem absorbed the outcome the way it absorbed weather. Quietly, instinctively, without demanding explanation. Those who understood power best recognized what had happened immediately. They did not debate it, they did not test it, they accepted it. This was how order restored itself when guided by someone who understood timing. The message was not delivered through fear, it was delivered through finality. Bumpy Johnson did not speak about it publicly. He did not correct rumors or allow them to grow. Silence did the work more effectively than any statement could. The fewer words attached to the outcome, the harder it became to challenge. Uncertainty protected the lesson. People who had known the brother felt the loss privately, if they felt it at all. Grief did not belong in public spaces. Sympathy did not demand investigation. In Harlem, emotions were handled discreetly, the same way business was. Whatever pain existed stayed contained, because containment preserved survival. The absence became normalized faster than anyone expected. Chairs filled, routes changed. The city closed around the gap and continued functioning. That continuity was the clearest signal that the resolution had been accepted. Disruption would have meant disagreement. There was none. Those outside Harlem might have expected retaliation or fallout. They did not understand how systems like this maintained balance. When a correction was made properly, it did not ripple outward. It settled inward. That was the difference between chaos and control. Bumpy's authority did not increase visibly. He did not expand his reach or assert dominance. He allowed the city to return to routine, because routine confirmed stability. Stability was always the goal. Anything louder would have suggested insecurity. The brother faded from the story without becoming a legend. There were no exaggerated retellings, no cautionary myths attached to his name. That, too, was deliberate. Legends invite imitation. Silence discourages it. Harlem did not need another story. It needed understanding. Those who carried knowledge carried it carefully, not as gossip, but as awareness. Awareness shaped behavior far more effectively than fear. Men learn not because they were told, but because they observed the outcome and recognized the pattern. This was how Harlem learned, not through speeches or threats, but through adjustments that made sense once observed. The city respected consistency. It trusted results that arrived without explanation. The loudest events left the fewest witnesses, and this one left almost none. That did not weaken its impact. It strengthened it. The less that was known, the more carefully people behaved. Imagination filled the gaps, and imagination always worked harder than truth. By the time the absence fully settled, the moment itself no longer mattered. What mattered was the structure that remained intact. Bumpy Johnson had preserved it without forcing the city to look directly at the cost. Harlem understood without being told. It always did. And in that understanding, the story of the brother ended not with noise or record, but as a shadow, felt, acknowledged, and then folded quietly into the city's memory, where it would stay unspoken and unquestioned, exactly as intended. Bumpy Johnson lived the rest of his life surrounded by people, yet quietly alone. After that night, nothing about his authority weakened. If anything, it hardened. The city moved with more caution, more respect, more awareness of boundaries that no longer needed explanation. But survival did not feel like victory. The choice he had made stayed with him long after Harlem adjusted. Power had protected him, but it had not spared him. The absence left by blood carried a different weight than any rival ever could. Rivals were expected. Family was permanent. Authority could manage threats. It could not restore what had been broken. From then on, Bumpy became more deliberate. He spoke less, listened more. Distance replaced familiarity, not out of suspicion, but out of understanding. He had learned that closeness created risk, and risk demanded calculation. Men still sought his presence, still deferred to his judgment, still measured themselves by his reaction. But fewer were invited near. The circle tightened, not because he feared betrayal, but because he understood its cost. Power continued to function, but it felt heavier. It protected the structure around him while quietly isolating the man inside it. Decisions came easier. Nights felt longer. There was no regret in the way people often imagine. Regret implies uncertainty. Bumpy had none. He knew the decision had been necessary. What lingered was grief, disciplined and private. That grief reshaped his restraint. It refined his patience, deepened his silence, and reminded him that control did not equal peace. Power could preserve order, but it could not soften loss. Those closest to him noticed the shift. He was present but unreachable, attentive yet reserved. The warmth that once appeared in quiet moments became rarer, not gone, but guarded. In Harlem, this change was interpreted correctly. It did not signal weakness. It signaled cost. Men respected him more, not because he was feared, but because he had endured something they hoped never to face. The city continued to function beneath his steady presence. Order held. Boundaries remained clear. Yet behind that clarity lived a silence that never lifted. This was the side of power rarely acknowledged. It secures, but it separates. It protects, but it also removes. What it takes cannot be reclaimed, only carried. Bumpy carried it without complaint. He understood that leadership demanded sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice came without recognition. The city would remember his strength. It would never see the price. In that imbalance, his reputation grew, while his inner world narrowed. Power did not abandon him. It stayed, steady and reliable. What left was something quieter, something human. Winning had preserved Harlem. It had preserved his life. It had not preserved everything, and Bumpy Johnson accepted that truth without seeking comfort. He remained respected, composed. Yet the man who emerged afterward was shaped by what power had demanded. Strength endured, silence remained, and what was lost stayed lost, carried forward as the unseen cost of survival, reminding him daily that protection and isolation often arrive together, bound by power itself. That understanding settled into his posture, his routines, his careful distance from comfort. It shaped how he watched, how he waited, how he trusted. Nothing about it felt dramatic. It was simply permanent. Power kept him standing. Silence kept him alone. Together, they defined the man he became, a figure respected by many, fully known by none, moving forward with authority intact and intimacy gone, preparing the ground for the legacy that would follow, where meaning mattered more than comfort and restraint became the language by which he would be remembered. Long after the moment passed, and the city continued breathing around him, unchanged on the surface, forever altered underneath, carrying forward the truth that power costs something. Years later, people remembered the lesson, but not the details. They forgot the room, the night, even the faces. What endured was the boundary. Harlem understood that family was not currency, not leverage, not entertainment. It was sacred territory. Bumpy Johnson's darkest test became a reference point, not because of what he did, but because of what he refused to do publicly. The city learned that power did not need spectacle to be effective. Restraint under pressure carried more authority than rage ever could. Men spoke more carefully afterward. Jokes softened. Ambition paused before crossing invisible lines. The incident did not breed fear. It produced clarity. And clarity reshaped behavior quietly. That understanding stayed, long after names faded, guiding choices without explanation or repetition daily. Older men told the story sparingly, choosing moments when advice mattered more than drama. They did not glorify blood or loss. They spoke about restraint, about knowing when action would damage more than it fixed. Young listeners absorbed the lesson without asking questions. They learned that loyalty began at home and ended there too. Power could protect a neighborhood, but it could never excuse betrayal of blood. Bumpy's choice reshaped expectations across Harlem. It set a standard that did not need reinforcement. Once demonstrated, it governed behavior silently. People adjusted not because they feared punishment, but because they understood consequence. Understanding lasts longer than fear. That quiet rule traveled forward, shaping decisions, tempers, and futures, without demanding loyalty pledges or threats from anyone ever again. Bumpy Johnson's legacy settled into memory differently than most. He was not remembered solely for dominance, but for discipline. The brother faded into silence while the lesson endured. That contrast mattered. Harlem respected the man who could hold power without indulging it. Over time, the incident lost its emotional sharpness, but kept its moral weight. It became guidance rather than warning. People referenced it when pride flared or shortcuts tempted. The test proved that leadership sometimes required enduring private pain to protect public order. That understanding became part of the city's internal code, passed carefully without embellishment. It survived because it explained limits clearly, offering direction without spectacle, cruelty, or repeated demonstrations of force and lasting consequences that shaped behavior quietly for decades afterward, permanently. In the end, the story did not belong to violence. It belonged to restraint. Bumpy Johnson's darkest test reshaped how Harlem understood strength, teaching that survival did not require cruelty. The line drawn that night held for years, sparing lives by discouraging excess. Power showed its limits by respecting blood, even when blood threatened power itself. That balance became the myth. Not loud, not celebrated, simply remembered. The audience leaves with understanding rather than shock, recognizing that some legends endure because they prevent chaos instead of creating it. This was not a tale of death, but of boundaries, and boundaries prove stronger than bullets. It closed quietly, allowing reflection to linger and meaning to settle long after the telling ended for everyone listening across generations. The lesson lingered because it was lived, not announced. Harlem carried it forward as shared wisdom, shaping tone, trust, and restraint. Bumpy Johnson became less a figure of fear and more a symbol of measured authority. His name invoked limits, not threats. That distinction mattered. It allowed order to outlast him, guided by memory rather than enforcement. Long after participants were gone, the boundary remained intact. The room never forgot because it never needed reminding. The line held quietly, proving that the strongest legacy is often the one that ends violence before it begins. It became guidance passed gently between generations, ensuring respect endured without bloodshed, spectacle, or the need for constant reminders in Harlem's memory long after names disappeared entirely from history books forever.